Welcome to the latest episode of the Digital Adoption Show, your go to podcast for cutting edge insights and innovative strategies in today's dynamic work environment. I'm your host, Abhirami Prakash, Sales Development Manager at Whatfix. Today, we're really excited to dive into key strategies for cultivating people and culture. Joining us is an extraordinary guest speaker, Derek Bruce, who happens to be a global HR thought leader and head of learning, leadership, and talent development. His LinkedIn profile also reveals his passion for motorcycles, football, men's fashion, and technology advancements. He certainly wears multiple different hats. Derek used to oversee global strategies as global manager at DSM Firmenich and plays a crucial role in aligning learning and development initiatives with organizational goals, significantly enhancing company culture and global performance. His role emphasizes innovation and cultural inclusivity across diverse regions, driving applications and firms such as DSM Firmenich success and growth. In addition to his corporate responsibilities, Derek is also the CEO of Derek Bruce Associates, a consultancy he founded in 2019 to combine his corporate expertise with a passion for personal and professional growth. Through this venture, he offered leadership development, executive coaching, and facilitates large-scale corporate events as a TEDx speaker, promoting sustainable business transformation and vibrant employee engagement. Derek's commitment to diversity and inclusion is evident through his creation of the Extraordinary Mentors Network, which supports Black professionals with career development opportunities. His career before DSM Firmenich, especially at Signify and ABN AMRO Bank, highlights his leadership in developing effective HR strategies and enhancing leadership capabilities on a global scale. Derek's impressive qualifications, including Chartered FCIPD and Master, underscore his extensive influence in shaping human resources and organizational development practices worldwide. Welcome to our podcast today, Derek. It's such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you. And I'm blushing after that introduction.
It's definitely one of the longest introductions I've given, so it speaks so highly of the qualifications that you have.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we dive into our serious discussions, we want to get to know the real Derek behind the multifaceted leader we know today. Hence, we have a sweet little segment called the Digital Pulse. This is where we try to get candid with our guests and understand what really drives them. So, Derek, is there a passion or activity outside of work that happens to be particularly close to your heart?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned on my link that football is something which is I do. And I currently play for an over 35s team on a Saturday morning in central London. And over the last couple of years, I've realized that the passion is playing football. And I love, since I've been able to walk and talk, I can play football. So I've loved playing, but I realized the passion is also, and it's a very strange thing, as a group of guys, we also get together after football and just have coffees and just talk and just share what's been going on for the week. And I love the ability for us to have that outlet, because many don't always have that somebody go and talk to. So I'm passionate about having us as a collective. And I arranged us to have like coffees in the same place every Saturday, just to have that space where we as men kind of open up after we play football as well. So I love that whole just collective talking out, sharing what's been going on, good, bad, the ugly as well. Yeah, so I'm passionate about just people being able to actually have the space to talk, in essence.
Oh, that sounds lovely and such a beautiful way to spend a Saturday and to have that community around. In fact, speaking of football, I'm going to start my very first rapid fire question around that. So, Derek, as a football enthusiast, if you could swap lives with one football, who would it be and why?
It's a great question. I mean, there's so many people who I think are awesome. I think for me, it would probably be, there's a guy called Ronaldo, a Brazilian footballer, the original Ronaldo, who I still feel is one of the best footballers who ever played. But he had this very up and down career where he was amazing and then had injuries. And it just would have been interested to experience the highs of some of the amazing things. He won a World Cup, for example, I think maybe two, but also then the lows, and see how, and not swap for the injuries, but just the experiences of resilience he showed, because he had, I think at one point his knees just weren't working. And then he came back and he won a World Cup the year after. So it's like that resilience, that ability to kind of motivate yourself, just be really interesting to experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it speaks so highly of the resilience to go back out there and win a championship like that. So, yeah, I can understand where you're coming from. And Derek, I know that you like Adidas. So, if
Yeah.
Adidas were to stop producing sneakers tomorrow, which brand would you switch your allegiance towards?
That's it. That's a hard one. I mean, I think most recently, since I've moved back to London, there's a designer called Paul Smith, and I kind of got into that his brand. And I think if Adidas wasn't around, and I do have copious amounts of Adidas superstars and Stan Smith's trainers, but it would then just be Paul Smith, I think. Yeah.
Would you know what's the count at in terms of your total number of sneakers?
Yeah, well, weirdly I do, because I moved recently and I had the joy of trying to kind of move and then store all my existing trainers. So when it comes to, embarrassing to say in public, when it comes to Stan Smiths alone, there's probably about nine. And then when it comes to superstars, there's probably 12. So it's about 20 different pairs, so to speak, that I use, and some are just kind of just on display. Yeah, it's a
Oh, that
very
is
strange. I seem to have that theme.
That's amazing. I know a lot of sneakerheads that would be very envious of that collection. So we also know that Muhammad Ali happens to be your role model. So if you could learn one skill from him, what would that be?
I think one thing I love, and I was talking to a friend about it because I've got an amazing picture of him in my office. I think amazing boxer, amazing sports person, but I think the one skill would be his storytelling. I think if you go back through celebrities and the whole people following people and being interviewed and having followings, one of the things I love about him and reading about him is how he articulated his experiences. You know, the way he spoke about fighting, but also civil rights, about his views on wars. But it was always a great story, and I love that ability to kind of lead and inspire people through words in a way which is engaging. And I think for me, the storytelling element Muhammad Ali brought to the world is something I would love to be able to do.
Interesting. I think
Yeah.
people mention that particular trait. So that's a very interesting note. And in fact, that brings an end to our digital pulse. So congratulations and very well done. So now we move on to our interview questions where we try and get to know more about really what makes Derek tick. So, Derek, before we start, could you
Mhm.
share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and what motivates you to really take on these multiple projects, and more crucially, how do you really manage your time?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I go back to how I got to where I am now, it's kind of through luck more than judgment. So I'll be completely honest. And if I recap, my very, very first professional role was working on an IT help desk and saying to people, turn it off, turn it on again, and it worked because that was back in the 90s. And having then worked through different roles and experiences, which gave me learning skills, leadership skills, sales skills, project management. And I think the motivation comes from I have a kind of, I don't know if you know this, I have a kind of a magpie kind of mindset where shiny things excite me. The magpies kind of, they steal shiny things. I don't go around stealing things, obviously. But I think it's just, I like doing things which are interesting, but also things which have an impact. So working on more than one thing at a time stimulates me greatly. I think if I kind of sit for too long, I sometimes get a bit like, oh, okay, what's next? And I have been told off for that occasionally by friends and family as well. But I like the motivation around other multiple projects, but because you make an impact and you change things, and also you kind of, from my perspective, you're bringing a value to being alive and contributing as well. In terms of time management, though, and that is a big balance in terms of wanting to do stuff, wanting to work on multiple projects, wanting to make an impact, but also being aware, especially around health and well-being and so forth as well. The time management piece is actually making sure I actively block time out. And I learned a great tip from a manager back in the US when I was at Signify. He was saying throughout his working day, he would only have 3 virtual meetings in his calendar at maximum a day. That would be it. So if somebody tried to put a fourth meeting in, he would either have to move one or reschedule a fourth meeting, but he wouldn't have more than 3 to give him time to one, to work, but also to give him time to also have lunch, go for a walk, talk to colleagues, talk to his team, engage with customers. And I remember thinking like, wow, that must be really hard because you're managing the whole US business and you're like, C-suite. But I took it on board and found that if you let people know that's how you're going to manage your time, there's a very valid reason behind it. Works. And all my roles subsequently, so Signify and then into DSM Furnish and my consultancy as well, I do limit what I do in terms of virtual meetings to only 3 a day maximum. And I've done that mantra now since 2017, 18. And that just means that I get time to work, I get time to kind of go for walks and grab a coffee. And that's kind of that's my thing. But also it's a great thing to role model with people who have back to back, especially post-COVID, back-to-back meetings. It's like call and call and call and call. And this just helps to kind of balance the whole timepiece from my perspective.
Interesting, and something to really aspire for. So that thank you for that. And to kick off this episode's theme, Derek, could you explain what cultivating people and culture mean to you and why is it really essential for organizations to focus on this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very much around, and culture is kind of what people do when no one's looking. It's that kind of thing. It's how people act, how people instinctively move towards their colleagues, their customers, their products, the value, the vision of the organization. And it's one of the, there's always many, many different phrases around, culture, eat strategy for breakfast, all those different kind of things. And I think cultivating people is very much around just making sure they want to be where they are when they're at work, making sure they really buy into the product you're doing, making sure that the role they're in is the right role they should be in, which makes them get the best out of themselves. And also making sure that the people who are all in your office or organization help you to actually achieve the profit you're trying to make as well and the impact you're trying to make in the world. So the whole culture piece is definitely around how you treat people as an organization, so from leadership downwards, but also how colleagues treat each other and how you then treat people around you. And you can see, some great companies I've worked for. And there's one example where I started working for DSM, and there's a cultural thing around safety because it was very much an operational and white collar role. And in the head office on the first day, people were walking downstairs all holding a handrail. And I started walking down in the middle of the stairs thinking, but culturally, health and safety was such a big thing. We wanted to make sure everybody was safe. And someone said, do you want to just hold the handrail to make sure you're okay walking downstairs? Because we want to make sure everybody's safe. And that was just somebody who I'd never met, who took the time to explain why this was a big thing. And I think it's those kind of things where you can measure culture in terms of people doing the right thing because it's the right thing. People supporting colleagues, people being aware of as well. And I think cultivating it, supporting, developing, engaging employees helps have a great culture.
That's really something to aspire for and a great takeaway. In fact, one of the major aspects of leading teams is really keeping them motivated, which adds to the culture as well. Could you share an example with us on how you do this and really describe maybe an action that can lead to a measurable improvement?
I think that motivation is one of those topics which, and I've done leadership development programs for years, always comes up. And I think the one thing I've always said over anything above is every employee you have is motivated by something different. So somebody might be motivated by growth, by development, by career progression. Somebody might be motivated by time outside the office, by a certain project, by a new computer, whatever, I don't know. And I think the one thing I would say in terms of how to motivate people when I've managed teams is to get to know the people and understand what motivates them and then put in place those particular things to help them get motivated. So if I know one of my team members loves being recognized for pieces of work they do, and that motivates them, but I make sure we're recognized when they do a great piece of work. If I know a team member likes being motivated by the ability to actually balance their work-life balance. So if they do a great piece of work, is there a way they can actually then work from home, for example? It's having those kind of conversations that people understand, or I understand from my perspective, what motivates others, and then putting those mechanisms in place that they can actually be met. I don't think one size fits all, but you can measure improvements by putting in place the triggers which somebody will then want to hit, because that's kind of their big thing, alongside obviously the KPIs and things we do as goals and objectives. But I think the personal things is very much around getting to know your people, understand what motivates them intrinsically, and then trying to put in place those little triggers which they will then try to aspire to meet as well.
So it's really a lot of effort to try and understand what is it that caters to a person individually and try to adapt your entire style around that. That's
100%.
quite resource and time intensive.
I wouldn't say, because I think if you're in a management role and you're leading people, I think is fundamental. And that's kind of the bigger part of a role. And I think some managers misunderstand the almost a privilege, but also misunderstand the priority they should play when you lead people. To have people underneath you, that should be one of the things which help you reach your targets, helps you reach your goals, helps the company be successful. How you manage them is what does that. So for me, I think the time element, you save time by investing time because the team then becomes more effective and more efficient as well.
Well, that's very interesting to hear. You save time by investing time. I like
Yeah.
that a lot. So, Derek, you happen to have begun your career with a background in design and architecture before transitioning over to HR and leadership development. How have those early experiences shaped your approach to leadership and organizational development?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very short period of time when I did design and architecture, but I think one of the things which really helps is thinking about form versus function. And by that I mean what something looks like, how it is, how it kind of, presents itself versus what it's supposed to do and what impact it's supposed to make. And I think when I look at leadership development and OD, a lot of the things we do in HR, myself included, are great, amazing, shiny things which we love. It might be a new learning management system. It might be a new leadership portfolio. It might be a brand new learning tool which allows people to use AI or virtual goggles. But if it has no impact, if it has no ability to help the people you're doing, if it has no, to me, if it has no so what, then it has no value in us doing it. So I think one of the things I've kind of taken from how design and architecture works is very much form and function, making sure whatever it is brought in to help support leaders, organizations, people, HR, whatever it's going to be, also has a real function which makes an impact. And that's for me, there's always a question is if we do X, Y, and Z, so what? Does it have an impact? And if it doesn't, then why are we doing it? So I think that's one of the key things I've learned from design into the whole HR people piece as well.
Got it. And often cultivating culture can present its own set of challenges. Could you discuss a significant challenge that you might have faced in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think culture, as we said, is very much people. And I think if I go back to my early part of my career working for an awesome company in the UK, which published newspapers, which is showing how old I am now, but now it publishes online content. Working with a certain demographic within the organization was very difficult because culturally learning wasn't something which they did. So they would come into work, do their role, and then go home. And they never had the ability to be presented with learning. Things like performance management, leadership development, talking about how you're going to grow were things they'd never experienced culturally. So that particular challenge was very much around talking to individuals and the leaders of that particular team and understanding how to then move people away from the status quo, understanding what kind of benefits they needed to actually see to get people to move away, but also putting in place really small, quick wins. I call it low-hanging fruit, things, you can speak of a tree and it's really easy. So I think the challenge was very much around introducing learning as a way of thinking, as a business as usual, to a culture who never wanted to learn because they kept thinking we knew it all. And I think if I look back in my career, having to evolve that group, and it was basically a group of journalists from we know how to write, we've been trained happy journalists, through to also how do you develop your colleagues? How do you move from print media to digital media? How do you manage young journalists? How do you support career progression of young journalists? That was a huge, probably still the biggest of my career in terms of moving that community from we don't need it through to, okay, we're going to listen. We're going to attend some of these classes. We're going to talk to you. And that was probably the most challenging aspects of my career, I would suggest.
Could you give us some insight or maybe a strategy that helped you overcome that challenge?
I think the main thing was kind of putting in place during the conversations what could be and trying to highlight the positive ramifications of if they did kind of embrace learning. So it's very much, there's a change model called freeze, unfreeze, refreeze, which is basically looking at what's going on and thinking, okay, this is kind of the situation. Let's kind of unfreeze what's going on. So and the unfreeze was, okay, we have some great people, but they need development, they need support, yourselves included. Talking that through, and it was a lot of conversations, lots of showing what positive could be, showing what the future could be, highlighting the benefits. Once those conversations started to get traction, kind of going, okay, right, so the change is that. The change is going to be, we're now going to be looking at, for example, performance management. We're now going to give you guys leadership development. So when you are leading young journalists, you know to have conversations one-to-one, to give feedback, give coaching, all that beautiful stuff. And once that started to kind of bed in, then refreeze. So give them affirmation about the positives that happened because they had changed behavior. So because you've now changed, because you've now doing stuff which is great, let's kind of refreeze the situation where you're being acknowledged, you're being recognized, you're seeing the benefits, and that is then the new norm. So that's something which, as a kind of a simple description, was the process I used.
In fact, Derek, when you were mentioning that you worked with journalists and that was also a vertical that you had experience with, it got me thinking, how do you actually adapt your strategies across different organizations and industries?
I think it's one of those things where I've been lucky enough to work in, I think, like media, retail, technology, bioscience, financial services. So I've been lucky to see different ways of doing the same thing with different background. And I think the adaptation is one, understanding the culture, and that whenever we're going to a role, just really spending time with different parts of a business, understanding what it is we do and how we do things. What is the kind of, what's the mindset behind stuff? What's the things people do when no one's looking, and understanding that culture? And then adapting the content to suit that. So for example, when I was in financial services, it's very, very, very structured. So putting learning in place is actually quite easy because you're regulated, you have to do certain stuff. People in financial services expect to have learning, have development, to have that growth. It's just a given. If I look at journalism and media, it's not regulated in the same way. You don't have to do stuff. So the adoption or the agility was very much around, okay, getting the relationships built, understanding the benefits, understanding why people may not want to do this, addressing those barriers and actually then creating new opportunities, getting a low-hanging fruit, as I said as well. It's very much around understanding what people do, how to do things, and starting with them as a context rather than taking what you've learned beforehand and just thinking it's going to work in a new place. I think that kind of is what I've done career-wise.
Mhm. And does your approach differ when you're working with a startup as opposed to a larger organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's two or three things that are really, really different. I think one, with a startup, you don't have the structural stuff in place in general. So I mentioned, for example, performance management, leadership development, change management, all those things which we kind of know within. As a startup, you're just trying to make sure that you exist the day after. You're trying to make sure people get access to your product. So those processes aren't in place. So for me, with a startup, it's very much around, okay, how can we start to help develop people and support people to do the job they need to do? The process stuff can come when it needs to come, when the scale's there. So it's kind of more, what is the stuff we need to do to make sure that we're getting people with the ability to do the right thing at the right time to get stuff to customers as well, versus a large organization where you have a lot of processes which might be, on the flip side, might be quite old and wieldy and kind of heavy because they've been processes in place for ages. So sometimes it's also how do you strip back those processes will make them more agile as well. So it's very much around adapting what the background of a context is to what the organization needs to be doing going forward. And I think lots of organizations are now questioning their speed of delivery over the last 4 or 5 years because COVID, the wars, the economic situation, all these things, all these, VUCA things which were VUCA back in many years ago, kind of weekly things in some cases. So how do we as companies react to these stuff quickly? Is now something I'm seeing much more of a question as well.
Mhm. Got it. And since our show is called the Digital Adoption Show, we happen to be particularly interested in how technology actually impacts strategies. So, Derek, in what ways has technology influenced your strategies for cultivating people and culture within organizations?
I think one of the things it's done is it's made it easier. And I say that from a sense of if I look at my career and bringing in access to learning or leadership development or all those kind of cool things, a lot of it was paper-based. A lot of it was very much, you do this, you send it, you email, whatever. What I'm loving now is the accessibility of learning content to people in a way which makes it simple and easy to do. So it's kind of influenced my strategies, because one of the things is I don't need to think about content as much, because you probably know as well as I do, I can name 4 or 5 social media platforms which provide amazing content on any topic across the world. So I think that's one of the nice things in terms of it takes away the focus on content, and it actually moves the role and strategy as a learning professional much more towards connecting people, much more towards facilitation of relationships, much more towards marketing as well. Actually, if I think about what I do, it's much more around how you communicate and manage projects, going back to the first conversation we had. But I think on the flip side, it's also got its own risk, where visibility is a need I'm seeing to manage the noise of technology. And by that, I'm saying sometimes I see and hear managers, employees, and HR people talk about being overwhelmed because there's so much, because you've kind of got the stuff you do in the office and then the stuff you do outside the office. So it's almost about there's a need to help balance what is great about the changes. And there's a great example, a very quickly tell you about a real story which happened a couple of weeks ago. I was getting a train back home from somewhere, which is where they don't use public transport, but trains exist. And I heard a lady making coffee in one of the kiosks talking to a friend about a wedding. And she was saying, I've seen this amazing video on TikTok and it allows me to understand how to do this hairstyle you want for your wedding. I'm going to come over on Friday. I'm going to bring my phone. I'm going to show you TikTok. We're going to then do it and you're going to have your hair ready for your wedding. And I'm on the platform thinking, so this person had a need, which was how to do this hairstyle. Went up to TikTok, found the style, knows how to do it, is confident in doing it, and is going to go and take it to her friend. And her friend trusts her enough to have her friend make her hair for her wedding. Not a night out, but for a wedding. And it has been kind of, it's a common thing. And like, so people can find content and learn how to do a certain skill just like that. But she's not a hairdresser. She's just somebody who knows how to do one thing. So I think for me, the technology is also how do you adapt and balance. I can do a certain skills one-off versus I still have the sustainable ability to do this particular activity as well. I think that's where I'm seeing strategies I'm now discussing and looking at. That's a common conversation as well.
It's quite fascinating, Derek. And I think in today's modern work environment, we strongly agree. I think technology is such a double-edged sword with its pluses and on the flip side as well. So yes, absolutely. Lastly, for our young audience looking for guidance, what advice would you give to the young leaders aspiring to cultivate a great culture within the organization?
I think there's probably 3 things I would say. The first thing is lead by example. So if you know the culture and you think the culture is represented by what you do and how you bring yourself to work, do it. Lead by example and actually just kind of live it. I think that is one thing which, it kind of breeds people doing the same kind of thing. The other thing, which is the opposite, is if you see people not kind of living a culture, call it out. Have the brave and autonomy to kind of discuss with your colleagues, highlight things which aren't great, which don't align with what you think the culture is. Because I think culture is also if you allow things to happen which aren't a great culture, they snowball. So you need to also feel brave and say, actually, what I'm seeing you doing, how I feel you've done that, whatever it's going to do, what I think you've said, that needs to also be called out. But I think the last thing is if you're a leader, kind of just have what's I'm looking for? Have the bravery to also evolve the culture. Culture isn't one thing, it's a living organism for me. It changes as organizations, as people change, as markets change. So also feel brave enough as well as living it to also evolve it. So if I see there's something, a behavior, there's a model, there's an understanding which I think is going to be great for our culture, bring it in, introduce it, share it as well, because people can improve cultures by improving cultures. I know it's a really obvious sentence, but kind of have that bravery also to say, okay, I think we could also do this. We can bring this. This is new. This makes sense. This is, yeah, whatever aspect it is as well. I think that for me is also how you bring a great culture to an organization.
Wonderful. I think on that note, it's a wrap from our side today. That was probably one of my most interesting episodes so far. Thank you so much, Derek, for taking out the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the privilege of talking to you as well.
Absolutely our pleasure. Before we go, to our listeners, please tune into the Digital Adoption Show across platforms to listen to much more interesting, intriguing, and fun more conversations coming your way with some of the top minds across the digital space. We are available on Apple, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Whether you're at home or on the go, don't miss out on our latest episodes. Thank you again, Derek, for being a part of this episode. We wish you the very best. I'm your host, Abhirami, signing off today.